Hello and welcome to this advanced episode of the Bible Toolbox, where we seek to help you enjoy the Bible through the tools that scholars and programmers have created for you. And in this advanced episode, so we're talking about topics that are more for Bible students or pastors, higher level. And we're going to talk about textual criticism. So this is a lesson/discussion that I did. And textual criticism is the study of manuscripts. So our Bible didn't just fall from the sky, but it was written, inspired humans who wrote it down. And they wrote it on manuscripts. They wrote it on paper with pens. And those were copied and copied and copied. And so we're going to talk about the process and the how we got our Bible today. So hope you enjoy.
Okay, so this is going to be a 45-minute crash course on textual criticism, which is impossible, but hopefully after this you'll get a sense of just like an overview of what the field is, where it's going, how we can interact with it. So what is our goal as Christians? We in terms of the Bible, we want to get back to what the biblical authors, what God intended for us to have, right? We want the original text that bears the authority of God is our goal. The problem with that is we don't have any of the original manuscripts, and all we have is copies. But these copies differ from each other in thousands of places. So our Christian faith has developed over time. So you have, especially in the Old Testament, you have books being composed and then they're being added onto, or more books are being added to the canon, and so on. Like there's a whole developmental process to that until it reaches a final form that bears the authority of God. And then that is what is copied. And we don't have this final form. We don't have, the letter that Matthew, or the gospel that Matthew handed out to everyone. That original copy, or that he wrote, we don't have. The autograph is what it's called. We only have copies of it, and the copies differ. And so that's what textual criticism is. It's analyzing the copies in order to get as close as possible to the final form. And so to do this in the New Testament, we have over 5,000 Greek manuscripts, tons of ancient translations and church father quotations, and papyri and so on. And we have tons of manuscripts because the New Testament doesn't have any, the church, there was no like official control over the proliferation of these manuscripts. It was just, Paul wrote a letter. He said, copy this and send it to the next town. And that's how the New Testament was spread, where the Old Testament was in the temple. It was by the scribes, the priests, kept that contained. And so there are less witnesses, but there are big problems, but they're not quite as extreme as the Greek manuscripts that we have. But we're just going to mainly focus on the New Testament, but we have several witnesses to the Old Testament. Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. Okay. So when I talk about copies differing, that is called a textual variant. And there are misconceptions of what a variant is. A variant is not every difference between every manuscript. A variant is only variant readings that are contained in manuscripts. So each of these rectangles here represents a manuscript. Okay, and we're just pretending that this is the original manuscript. This is the right manuscript, and then it was copied 3 times, and it was copied wrong twice. right? And then these are copied and so on. And so you could, some people think a textual variant is, oh, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 6 mistakes, 6 textual variants. But that's not. There's only 3 readings. So there'd be, 2 textual variants or 3 textual variants. I don't, however you would count that. But there's the
So there's like
original
the
and then
orange and
2
the blue
readings.
and the red
Yeah,
are the 3. That's how you'd count 3.
right.
Hmm.
So there's claims like this. There are 400,000 New Testament textual variants, but only 138,000 words in the New Testament. And sometimes people say, oh, but there's 5,000 manuscripts. So if you divide 400,000 divided by 5,000, then we're okay. But that's a misunderstanding of that's counting manuscripts, right? That's not counting variant readings. This is actual variant readings, which the claims like this have to be put in context that most of these variants no one would bat an eye to. They're, words are out of order, or a synonym is used, or maybe like an and is dropped, or like most of the mistakes are very easy to track. And so when we talk about variants, just like be aware of these sensationalist type of statements, because variants shouldn't be counted; they need to be weighed according to their importance. And okay, this is Peter Gurry did a whole math experiment basically of how many variants we have, and his math came, we have 1 new variant reading per 434 words. That so we have one variant reading every paragraph, or like every page. I mean, that's a so
Can you back up to the there slide? So this might be a dumb question, but how do they count it if, like, let's say in the 3rd column there, so the blue there is the original, but if that one had a mistake, like if it was purple,
so that would be 4 variants.
Okay.
Is that
Yeah.
right here?
Yeah. But we lost like the original, so none of them got through to become all the way to the end untouched. Or uncorrupted, I guess.
Right. So are there places in the Bible where we don't have the original reading? Is that kind of what you're asking?
Maybe. Or more, my question was more about the math. Like, how do you count if they're both? Is that 2? I guess you're saying that's 2 because.
So if we don't have the original, but this is only, you can only count them if you know the original here.
Yeah.
So there are a few places where people have conjectures of what the original was. They don't think any of our manuscripts have the original, but those are very few places, and people argue that what we have is the original. So in general, the textual criticism isn't, we're not trying to like collect manuscripts to find lost texts in our Bible. The general problem that we have is we have too much text, and we're trying to trim it down and figure out what's the original. But yeah, we'll get more into that. Yeah. Okay. So we talked about weighing manuscripts, not just counting. And so most variants are spelling differences and word order differences. And in English, word order matters. In Greek, it doesn't matter quite as much. There are meaningful variants that are not viable. So there's a textual variant in 1 Thessalonians that says, "We became horses among you." I think it's the difference between nepioi and hepioi, like gentle and horses are really close. But obviously that was just a scribal mistake. And there's many that are neither meaningful nor viable. So the ones we care about are the ones that are meaningful and viable. There's enough textual witnesses to it, and it changes the meaning of the text. And so the biggest ones are the John 8, the account of the adulterous woman, he who is without sin, throw the stone first. That one is not in our earliest manuscripts. Neither is the ending of Mark. And some manuscripts don't have Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do in Luke 23. So those are kind of like the heart-wrenching textual variants. And there's all sorts of debate over what to do with these. So if somebody says that they shouldn't be in our original canon, most would say, but they're still witness to really early Christian tradition. So some will even say, no, the adulterous woman account shouldn't be in John, but it is a true account of something Jesus did. But we're not going to get into all of those debates. The internet will fill in the gaps there. Okay, so what kind of mistakes do the scribes make? Most of them are unintentional. They, skip a line when they're copying, or they're tired, they miss a letter. They see the same letter on the end of a word and skip over a word, and whatever. Like all normal things. If I was to dictate to you something and you were writing it down, you would make countless mistakes. And that's just human error, and those are easy to catch. There are intentional mistakes, and this doesn't necessarily mean they're malicious mistakes, just like harmonizing the Gospels. I think this is the account where John comes eating and drinking. One of them only came eating, and one has eating and drinking. It would be easy if you're a scribe and you just know the account to just write eating and drinking together.
Or one of the Gospels has a prohibition against taking a staff out on their missionary journeys when Jesus is sending the apostles, but the other one says they can take a staff. So
yeah, I bet there's a variant there. So that would be an example of the second. There's times where the scribe corrects discrepancies. So in Mark 1, it says according to the prophets, where the earliest manuscripts have according to Isaiah. The quote after it is from, I think, Malachi and Isaiah. So it's kind of correcting, there's multiple prophets, not just Isaiah. Explanatory glosses. So the angel troubling the water with the lame man who was trying to get healed. That's our earliest manuscripts don't have that. So it seems to be like maybe it was a scribal note that was then added in later or something like that. There's a lot of liturgically motivated additions like amens, doxologies, pronouns. So when a new paragraph starts or a new chapter, rather than saying, and he went down, it'll say, and Jesus went down, because it's a new reading for the day and your people need context. Fixing grammar, theological motivations. That's kind of similar to the corrections of discrepancies there. Don't think like they're morphing the whole New Testament to fit their theology. This is just little things like this. Like you want the scriptures to be talking about the right thing. I have here the three who bear witness in heaven: the Father, the Word, the Spirit. Was probably added a lot later. There's a variant over. This is in the Old Testament. It says God will never die, and there's a lot of variants there. Saying we will never die. Because God can't die. And
or the beginning of Mark 1, where there's some discussion about the divine name. if it was just Jesus or Jesus, the Son of God.
Yeah. That is a huge, we'll talk about that one more later or on Friday. So, okay, looking at all these errors and such, scholars they've compared manuscripts and they've seen that they kind of fall in different families. Like there's manuscripts that have similar mistakes, similar readings. And so the three are Alexandrian, Western, and Byzantine. And so generally how scholars today talk about it is Alexandrian text type is more careful, shorter, generally, not fixing grammar and elaborating on things. The Western is very much harmonizes and has additions to the point that Codex Beza, which is the main text of the Western, adds 8% more text in Acts. So, like, lots of elaboration there.
Oh, where does it get the name Western? Because I'm assuming it's not from like North America.
Oh, yeah. So, yeah, all these should probably be in quotes. It's basically there used to be more elaborate theories of the origins of these texts, these text families. And those are kind of like, well, people kind of are like, I don't know if that's actually, where
it's not necessarily geographic.
Yeah.
Right.
So okay. Alexandrian, this is the kind of text that was coming out of the library at Alexandria where Origen and Clement would have been. So that's where it gets Alexandrian. Western, in terms of, like, you think the Latin West versus the Greek East.
Right.
And so you have people like Jerome, Tertullian are key Western theologians. But no one really like highlights the geography as much. This is just the name, the label that's stuck
sure.
over time.
Okay.
And then last one, the Byzantine. This is the text that supposedly became popular in Constantinople, so in the Greek East, the Byzantine Empire. And so this became the main text for the Greek church, who was reading Greek and so on. And so it is also called the majority text because most of our manuscripts are from this family, because it's Byzantine, right? The Byzantine Empire is using Greek manuscripts. Yes. Okay. So quick history of textual criticism. So textual criticism, everyone's always been doing it to some extent. Like, you can even read in the early church fathers, they're debating over different readings. But in terms of like our modern practice, Erasmus is the first one to really, he put together the Textus Receptus, looking at, he started out with 7 manuscripts. I think in later editions, it got up to somewhere around 14 or 20, something like that. Yeah, none earlier than the 11th century. So this was the best he had. And they're basically all Byzantine text types. After Erasmus, this is super simplified. People will probably get mad at me about this, but archaeology happens 1700s, and famously 1849 Tischendorf discovers Sinaiticus, which is one of our fullest early manuscripts of the New Testament, and even the Old Testament, Septuagint as well. And so there's scholarly discussions over what manuscripts should have priority and such, and everyone was following the Textus Receptus basically before this, that this is the text received by the church. It's the inspired text that God intended, that he preserved. And in 1881, two scholars, Westcott and Hort, really shifted the tide away from Byzantine text type towards Alexandrian text type. And then in the 1900s is when we've really discovered lots of papyri. So pre-1900, there's only about 9 or so papyri that were circulating around. By 1930, in the 1930s, there was over 40, especially the Chester Beatty papyri, which are really significant. And this kind of popularized using papyri. And yeah, today we have over 140. And these aren't, a lot of these are just scraps. I mean, just paragraphs of text, but yeah, these have helped us gain a better understanding of the development of New Testament text. And so the standard edition today is the Nestle Aland text. Well, they're taking all these manuscripts and work into account. Yeah, Old Testament, you have the Dead Sea Scrolls. Okay, so how Westcott and Hort changed the tide. Their basic argument is that they are Byzantine readings are late. That the earlier you go among the church fathers, the more Alexandrian the text is, not Byzantine. They're inferior. They're more kind of what we talked. They're like fixing grammar and making the reading better, and so they're inferior in terms of that. And then they are secondary. So the Byzantine readings often conflate Alexandrian and Western readings. So the Alexandrian will say one thing, the Western will say another, and then the Byzantine will put both of them together, and say, Jesus did this and this, or something like that.
Interesting. So they're like the people who made the Byzantine copies. In a sense, you think of it like that's what we're trying to do today, where we're trying to compare like everything we have and come to one. But the difference is we're not, like, scholars today are not necessarily trying to like add everything in. They're trying to get back to what was the autograph, right? And so that's where they would maybe like eliminate something from one or the other.
Yeah, we have much more access to manuscripts than they did. Even in like the patristic time, it was the standard manuscript was in certain churches. But like, you don't have, we now have access to all of these manuscripts through the internet and other mediums. So that's kind of the benefit that we have in the modern period is just access to all these the papyri and all these new manuscripts that we have. From 20 to 5,000 manuscripts.
So I've heard somebody make the argument on the Dead Sea Scrolls that if some group like the Qumran people there had taken the text and like squirreled them away in jars in a cave, that they weren't like the texts that were out being circulated, and so they're maybe even less trustworthy, even though they're older.
Yeah,
because for that reason.
Yes,
and I guess that could be argued both ways.
Good. So that's one of the arguments for. There are people who say the majority text is actually the most reliable text. So what you just said there, here, many manuscripts later means more early presence. Right? These were the ones that were most copied. That's why they wore out, and that's why we don't have early exemplars of them. Or these are the ones that had the best readings, so they kept being used, and that's why we don't have all these other ones. So that's an argument. Doctrine of preservation, that God will preserve his text. So that's more of a theological reason. And then this third one is the critical text. If we're just like stitching together all these manuscripts, we come out with a Bible that no Christian has ever used.
Hmm.
And so some people argue we should just take one manuscript and just stick with it, and have kind of like, well, that's kind of what the Old Testament does, right? Where you have the Masoretic text,
Mm-hmm.
and then you have footnotes, the where other versions differ, but they keep the Masoretic text. So some people argue that we should do that for the New Testament. So those are kind of like both sides of the line, and I don't have the time nor the expertise to make a judgment on that. So when we do textual criticism ourselves, we come across a passage that has a variant reading. What do we do? So the general principle is to prefer the variant that best explains the rise of the others. So basically, like kind of what I was saying with like nepioi versus hepioi. I can explain how horses came about. So just like getting the idea of explaining where these variants go and what's kind of the family tree of these variants. How do they come about? And you have to do that by looking at external evidence and internal evidence. So external being your manuscripts. So you want to prefer readings that are in the older and best manuscripts, right? And that best should maybe be in quotation marks, because people are going to debate what best means. You want to prefer readings that are widely distributed over geography. So if a reading is in, the Latin and the Syriac and the Greek and the Coptic and, whatever, like there's kind of like, oh, this is spread out widely, which means it was probably early, or it was probably original.
I never thought about that before. Interesting.
Yeah. And then probably the most important is knowing the individual manuscript itself, which admittedly none of us have time to like sit down and really get to know these manuscripts, but there's pictures of them, awesome digital images of them online that you can do this. And that's really what we should be doing. We should all be really deeply interacting with each individual manuscript. And then we kind of know the kinds of mistakes that scribe makes. But generally we don't have time for that.
So they get like a personality. Like you could become familiar enough with a certain manuscript that you got, oh, that guy was really good. Or
right.
Like,
yeah.
He was really careful, or this guy, he should have been a carpenter.
Yeah, or you see like the common mistakes that they make. So if he's constantly skipping over words and you come across a variant and this manuscript skips across the word, and it's like, okay, well, this guy skips across them all the time. So let's just throw that manuscript out for this reading. And then, okay, internal evidence. It's basically all the things we talked about. Prefer the ones that are shorter, because generally people are glossing or conflating readings. Prefer the harder reading because scribes had a tendency to correct readings. Prefer the reading that best accords with the biblical author. Prefer the less harmonious reading, especially in the Gospels. None of these principles, they're principles. They're not like a checklist or something like that. Evaluating textual variants is more of an art, or it is an art. It's not all that objective all the time, because you have to know the manuscripts well. You kind of get a feel for how scribes make mistakes, and all of this comes into consideration of what the original reading probably was. So eventually we're going to start doing these verse analyses. But you can see I've made a chart something like this. So this chart is from Kurt Aland, who is, the Nestle Aland. He's the Aland there.
Okay.
So he's like the producer of our modern Greek
NA28.
edition. Yeah. Yeah, the NA28. And so he categorizes manuscripts into 5 categories, and these are very biased categories. So you have level 1, or category 1 is basically all of the manuscripts that he thinks are important for determining the original text. So he puts basically all of the papyri in here, which I didn't list here.
Okay.
And yeah, Sinaiticus, Vaticanus, and so on are here. Then you have Byzantine is number 5, category 5, right? Because that's the least important. That's the most, right? He doesn't think that Byzantine is much help for determining the original text. And then you have the Western, and then basically category 2 is almost Alexandrian, but it has some other readings. Okay. And then 3 is kind of anything else. It has some Alexandrian characteristics, and it has some Byzantine or Western characteristics. But kind of what we were saying with the geographical spread, if you have a reading that is found in multiple different text families, that can help determine the reliability of that reading. So having it charted out like this is helpful in that respect. You have the date down one side and these categories across the top, and then if you put the different manuscripts, the readings in this chart, you can see it can help you get a visual for what's the most reliable reading at this point.
So have Bible scholars accepted these 5 categories? Or are they debated?
Well, the Alexandrian, Western, Byzantine are the 3 main branches that I think are fairly established. We're going to talk how this has been criticized. These 2 are maybe the bit more subjective there. So what I've done here is I've inserted all of the manuscripts that the Tyndale House Greek New Testament cites. So the NA28 has a huge apparatus and it cites tons of manuscripts. The Tyndale House Greek New Testament shortened that. And so these are the manuscripts, not including the papyri, that they cite. They also cite the papyri, but those vary on when a book, because papyri are a lot. It's usually just one book or one passage. So I didn't want to fill up the page here with those. Yeah. And so explaining the external, explaining the internal, looking at the picture of the earliest manuscripts versus the later, whether the reading is spread. And then there are textual commentaries. So the net footnotes, the most important textual variants are going to be discussed in the net footnotes. There's also Bruce Metzger has a commentary on the most important textual variants as well. And there's many others. And basically any commentary you pick up, if it's a technical commentary, so Anchor Bible Commentary, the Word Biblical Commentary, even the New International Commentaries, those are all going to have discussions of the most important textual variants. So it is good. It is good for us to go through all of this work, think external, internal, and do our work, as amateurs. But a really good thing for us to do is read a bunch of experts and their judgments. And once you do that over and over and over, you start to get a feel for how to do it well as well. So the earlier you are in the process, the more you should be depending on commentaries. until you get a feel for how it works, and then you can kind of do your own thing the more you get a feel for it. So okay, that's kind of a traditional or general way to evaluate textual variants. Those are different places to see readings. Okay, but this has been complicated a bit with the introduction of computers into the process of textual criticism. And so there's this method that's been developed called the coherence-based genealogical method. And it's still in process. It's still being done. So it's not every book of the New Testament has been complete yet. But the most important thing here is they are distinguishing between text and manuscript. So when a scribe, let's say in the 900s, copies a text from the 300s, how old is his manuscript? Right? Sure, maybe it's the manuscript itself is 900s, but the text on it goes back to the 300s, basically, right?
Right.
And so what we can do with the computer is collate, just basically transcribe, copy the text of all the manuscripts. And then you can use statistics to compare all of the manuscripts and how well they line up with each other. And then that helps us better group these manuscripts into families or categories. Like rather than it being subjective, we have like objective data. These two manuscripts line up super well, right?
So wait a minute, that brings up like a question on the age of the actual manuscript. So you were talking about the difference between the text itself and the manuscript. Like, how do we date the manuscripts? Do they do it on the type of paper that's used or papyri, or is it on like where it was found?
That's a great question. I don't know if I know
I
all of
assume
it.
there's some
Everything
way
you're
of
kind
getting
of saying
fairly
there.
accurate.
Yeah. I mean, there's like carbon testing.
Yeah.
There's looking at the script. So you can sometimes tell by the handwriting how old a manuscript is. Yeah, the type of ink used. Yeah, there are people who are absolute nerds in that. That I have no idea how that whole process is done. But
fascinating. So like CBGM is helping us like get rid of those prejudice over the age of the actual manuscript, and it's like blending all of the text into one body.
Yes.
To try and wow.
And so then using just the text to try to map. So after you see how well they align with each other, then you try to figure out which text is flowing from another, which basically means you do textual criticism through the entire New Testament and you just mark which way they go. And then you start to see, oh, this manuscript is constantly the source of this other one. Okay. And so that is a genealogical coherence. That shows you the flow between the manuscripts. And after that, you can get a global stemma, or the big picture of how all of these, the text of the manuscripts are functioning. So, this would be kind of the first initial, like the flow through, and you do this through all of your textual manuscripts. And then you can get kind of like a scatter plot type diagram, right? Where it'd be something like this. You're seeing this text is always flowing this way, except for this one time, or, these ones on the edges. And so now we can go back and reevaluate those one on the edges and think through them more carefully. And so it's kind of like a spiraling process that refines itself the more you do it. Yeah. So rather than just looking at one specific area, right? We're looking at this one variant in this one verse. It's taking the whole manuscript, the whole book, and that's bearing weight on your decision in the moment, because you're caring about the textual flow from one manuscript to the other, or one text to the other. I need it. And you can see their work online and actually do it yourself. You can download it, and that's what we'll do for next time. So even with all this computer work, we should just say that our confidence in the, or like, we've gotten back to the original about as good as we can. If you're a believer in the Byzantine text type, you're going to go read Maurice Robinson's book on the majority text. If you think kind of the Alexandrian is more reliable, then the NA28 is going to be, basically as close as we can get to the original, to the point that, Bart Ehrman, who is agnostic, says that at this stage, our work on the original amounts to little more than tinkering. Or, we're 96% certain of the text that we have.
Mm-hmm.
And so basically, so Bart Ehrman is actually, he's saying we've accomplished it. We've done everything we could to get back to the original. And he's saying, let's move on. And he actually wants to use textual criticism to look into the sociology of the early church. And so trying to find, when was a textual variant introduced and why was it introduced? Was there a controversy going on? Was there, like things like that? And that's actually pretty cool. And so that's actually another area where textual criticism can speak into, not just finding the original, but actually helping us with early church history as well.
But there's something comforting about the tinkering when you think about, the flip side is like, we just didn't care. I mean, this is like the word of God.
Yeah.
And when not one jot or not one tittle, to quote, Jesus, it's comforting that people have been doing this for as long as we can tell.
Yeah.
They've been trying to get it right. And the fact that we're trying to get it right, I mean, there's a million other pursuits that, the world spends a lot more resources and time on than this, that have no value, no profit. So let's tinker on. That's what I say.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, so the type of the Greek Bibles that we have around today, Nestle Aland is kind of the standard. The ECM is, this is like Nestle Aland times 20. It's very, very exhaustive and huge. It tries to categorize all the variant readings as much as possible. The UBS it's the exact same text as the Nestle Aland. It has fewer variants, and the variants that it has, it can be paired with Bruce Metzger's commentary, and he explains why they chose the text that they did, where the variants are. And so this is meant for Bible translators. It's just meant for a base text that Bible translators can use across the world. So I mean, this is the text that they're using in all the major Bible translation groups. There was the SBL, Greek New Testament, was edited by Michael Holmes. And this is basically, there's a lot of copyright stuff on UBS and Nestle Aland that people wanted something that was more accessible and available that could be shared and such. So the Society of Biblical Literature commissioned Michael Holmes to put that together. So that's available online. This is often the text you'll find on like apps and things like that, because it's so accessible. A fairly new edition, the Tyndale House Greek New Testament. It is also very accessible. You can find it free online in many places. The apparatus is less than the Nestle Aland, which I already kind of talked about. And they tried to retain certain features like early spellings. So rather than standardizing the spelling of one word across the whole New Testament, if the text, witnesses to this spelling that isn't usual, they kept it. And then they also tried to keep the same paragraphs as our early manuscripts, rather than choosing paragraphs that we decided on through interpretation and study.
Is this? I think I heard a podcast on this by it might have been that Dirk Jonkind.
Probably.
But he was saying how he had worked on the Tyndale House because he wanted like something that he could read, maybe more of a reader version. Is that accurate? Just like one that he would trust and read kind of in church.
Yeah, because it's more accessible, and it's Crossway has been doing a lot of things like that, making just a lot of cool ways to interact with the text. Like they have little like reading notebooks that you can have and like mark up the text, and readers editions and stuff like that.
Okay.
Yeah. You have the Textus Receptus, which there's not one Textus Receptus. There's so the King James seems to primarily use Beza's 5th edition of the Textus Receptus, but even then, it diverges from that in 190 places. That's because the King James translators were also doing textual criticism, right? They weren't just taking the text as it was; they were trying to get back to the original. So there's tons of editions of the Textus Receptus by different scholars. Erasmus and Beza are 2 of them. And it's also open domain and can be used really easily. Robinson Pierpont is the majority text. It's standard edition of the majority text. And it's also free to distribute. It notes all the places where it differs from the Nestle Aland. In Hebrew, Old Testament. All right. I'm going to save. We won't talk about the canon today. Different topic. But if you want more information about textual criticism, I mean, these are kind of the standard sources. Aland and Metzger are 2 of the guys that were on the committee for UBS and Nestle Aland. So if you want to hear from the guys who like did the work, their book is good. Their books are excellent. Daniel Wallace has a course on biblicaltraining.org for free that you can take. He is the person behind the net footnotes. And then I have a couple. These include Old Testament. This is an Old Testament. This is both Old and New Testament. This book is really good. This Elijah Hickson, Peter Gurry, Myths and Mistakes in New Testament Textual Criticism. So they're both evangelicals, and they got together a group of evangelical scholars to write chapters. And it kind of has 2 aims. One aim is responding to critical scholars on the one hand, but then on the other hand, they are responding to poor uses of apologetics. So Christians get overly excited and dogmatic, and they skirt over some of the more difficult things. And so they're kind of like calling out some of these myths and mistakes that apologists are making in order to try to defend the reliability of the New Testament. They are both writers at the Evangelical Textual Criticism blog, which is a phenomenal blog. They probably post once a week, if that, just kind of like updates of what's happening in textual criticism. So that's a good blog to just follow if you want to keep in touch with the field. All right.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Bible Toolbox. All of the resources mentioned in this episode are posted on our website, thebibletoolbox.com. There you can also find out more information on how to give and support us. And we have loved all of the encouragement and feedback we've received from you. So thanks so much.